Now, the term science fiction, expression science fiction, was invented by Hugo Gernsback. In fact, this cover from Science Wonder Stories in 1929 is the first time the expression science fiction was ever used. And down in the right-hand corner, you can see science fiction stories. Gernsback was an editor. He also wrote one very infamous science fiction novel called Ralph 124C41 Plus, which is an awful novel, but it was an effort to attempt to predict the future. And actually, that stands for Ralph 124C the Many. Gernsback thought that the literature that he was publishing in pulp magazines was to both entertain and educate people about the possibilities of science and technology, but to do so through stories as opposed through essays or theoretical expositions, etc. But Gernsback wasn't correct regarding his assessment of science fiction, because science fiction is a lot more than just about the future possibilities of science and technology. In fact, science fiction is about the future of everything. As a classic, superb example of a science fiction series, actually it's 4 novels, that covers the future of everything, I have up here the image from the first novel in the series, Hyperion. And on there you see this metallic being, the Shrike. And Hyperion was written in the late 80s and into the 1990s. And in the 4 volumes, we find discussions and themes of immortality, stellar networks, philosophers and poets, the reincarnation of John Keats, bio-nano-engineering, time travel, infinite ecologies of different worlds, supercomputers, the rise and fall of civilizations, religion, including the rise and re-rise of the Catholic Church to power, virtual reincarnation, which is John Keats, the second coming, which is achieved through time travel and turns out to be a woman, archetypes of good and evil, a debate between the future Dalai Lama and Grand Inquisitor, and just about everything else. In fact, science fiction facilitates integrative understanding of the future. It takes all the aspects of the future and brings them together into coherent wholes in which a story is told about the future. Hyperion is only one example of novels that have been created that cover all of the bases of future reality. Other great ones in history have been, in recent history, Stand on Zanzibar, the Mars Trilogy, The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, Matter by Ian Banks. And in the middle there I have, in a bigger image, The 20th Century by Albert Urbita. And this was written in 1880. And this was a very intricate vision of Paris in the 20th century, both social as well as scientific and technological. And Albert Urbita, besides being probably, in this novel, producing the greatest French science fiction novel of the 19th century, and I mean better than anything that Jules Verne produced, Urbita was also the first great science fiction artist, because in that book are like 300 or 400 illustrations that he did of various images he had about the future of Paris in the 20th century. So it was a very holistic type of thing. In fact, science fiction can get very global. And up here I have 2 recent excellent novels, one about the future of India, River of Gods, which is one of the best science fiction novels written in the last 15 years, about the future in India, in which it turns out that the Hindu deities are actually real, and it has to do with AI and time travel moving backwards. And the 3-body problem, which is, was written by one of the most influential contemporary Chinese science fiction writers, which is concerned, among other things, with maybe we don't want to contact alien intelligence. But it takes place in China over the last 50 years. Another aspect to it which is important to see is that science fiction is not dumb literature. science fiction really challenges the intellect. And all those novels I had up there are challenging to understand and read. And I bring up here H.G. Wells, because H.G. Wells, who is known for like The War of the Worlds and The Invisible Man and The Time Machine, H.G. Wells was a real thinker, a real intellect. And the book, The Shape of Things to Come, the first 200 pages of it is actually an intellectual analysis of the forces of history up to contemporary times, which you got to follow his arguments. And then the last 200 pages is a projection, a narrative projection into the future. So it combines a lot of thoughtful discussion of history with a narrative of the future. It's real idea literature. Now, the future of everything can mean everything about our world around us. But the future of everything can also mean the future of the universe, the future of the cosmos. And the person, Leslie has already mentioned him, the person who exceeded in this, probably greater than anybody else, was Olaf Stapleton in his two novels, Last and First Man and Star Maker. And in those two novels, Olaf Stapleton covers the entire future history of humanity and then the future of intelligence in the universe till 50 billion years in the future. And that's why Arthur C. Clarke said it's probably the most powerful work of imagination ever written. They're the most expansive narratives of the future ever written, because I said extending tens of billions of years out. They cover the future of the universe, but then they even go beyond it, because at the last part of the Star Maker, he goes into the idea of alternative universes. And he applies the notion of cosmic evolution not only to humanity, not only to intelligence across the galaxies, not only to universes, but even to the Star Maker itself, or himself, or herself, or whatever personal pronoun you want to use. Now, why do I say that science fiction is the evolutionary mythology of the future? A quote, "Science fiction is a literature of mythic imagination." That is, science fiction is mythology. And that's a starting point. So let's just have a look, for example, at what is myth in terms of at least its history to begin with. Myths are stories, and we have a heritage running back thousands of years of writing about extraordinary adventures into the unknown, to strange and fantastical places in which we encounter strange and fantastical beings in other realms. We also have a heritage running back thousands of years of talking about supernatural realms, supernatural higher realities that are often populated with beings and gods and goddesses who have fantastic powers. And so we have cosmic beings that we have been envisioning for thousands of years that in various ways are fantastical creations of our imagination. We also have a slew of end-of-the-world prophecies that run back thousands of years. That is, humanity, for as far back as the beginnings of recorded history, has not been locked into the here and now, but has extended its consciousness out into the far distant future, the far past, and into a variety of different kinds of strange and wondrous realities. And this is the heritage, this is the substance of our classical ancient myths, that they go to the farthest reaches of our imagination. And people who talked about, heard these myths, they believed in the credibility of them. They believed that the beings being discussed, in fact, were real, the gods and the goddesses, and their various powers. But we tend, in more modern times, at least some of us, to feel as if these myths have lost credibility. So do we believe in these kinds of beings anymore? Well, actually, over half of the population of the world still believes in the various ancient myths that were created back 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. Now, let's take a definition out of just Google that I found about what a myth is. A myth expresses a fundamental worldview of a people. And in fact, these stories that we had that were fantastical were really expressions of what people's basic beliefs were regarding the nature of reality and what was good and the way the world was put together. To give a more poetical version of that hits the nail on the head, from Otis Stapleton at the beginning of his book, Last and First Men, our aim is not merely to create aesthetically admirable fiction. We must achieve neither mere history nor mere fiction, but myth. A true myth is one which, within the universe of a certain culture, expresses richly and often perhaps tragically the highest aspirations possible within that culture. And so, following from that definition of what I said already, a myth is the credible transcendent of what is ultimately true and ultimately of value as seen by the people and cultures of a particular time, and engages in the fantastic, the wondrous, and the astounding, and hits us both cognitively and emotionally. It inspires us and it stretches our minds. Now, when I put all that together, I come up with like about 15 different qualities of myth, which hit us at all different levels. There's personification, there's archetypes in it, there's wonder and mystery, there's emotional, motivational dimensions, there's ethical aspects to myths as well too. There's aesthetic aspects. We have all kinds of images that go along with it. There's icons that get associated with myths. And I'm drawing upon Joseph Campbell and Carl Jung here, as well as some of the other items that I had mentioned previously. Now I'm going to just do a little flip for you. Every one of those qualities that describes ancient myths also applies to science fiction. Science fiction, not always in every story, but overall hits upon all of those same qualities. So in that sense, science fiction is identical with classical and ancient myth. But if we were to draw a distinction, and I'm using the book The World Beyond the Hill by two science fiction writers, historians, Alexei and Corey Panchin, the myth of the modern Western world has been science fiction, because science fiction adopts a new theory of reality and a new way of assessing credibility based upon a scientific vision of the cosmos and a transformed future and the theory of evolution in contemporary times. That is, what science fiction is, it's the modern credible transcendent, as opposed to classical myths, which were ancient credible transcendents. So, we can say that science fiction is the mythology of the future, both in that it is about the future and it is for the future. It provides new myths and evolves the possibility space of our own consciousness. It stretches our minds. But it inspires and engages us, and often has. So it's for the future in the sense that it gives us a sense of direction, it gives us a sense of ideas, it gives us a sense of possibilities for how to create the future. And up here I have an article from The Futurist, New Myths for the New Millennium by Stanley Krippner, and in fact science fiction provides credible new myths informed and inspired by science and contemporary thought. And I say that with a qualification, because we'll see that it's not always entirely true, but generally it is. Now let's bring in the word evolutionary. The future ain't what it used to be, and it never was. One sense in which science fiction is evolutionary is that it builds upon itself. It has a cumulative heritage. You can't write good science fiction unless you know the history of science fiction, because you think you have an interesting idea, well, somebody had it before you. So it has this heritage running back that's been in a continual state of evolution. It's a think tank. It continually evolves. But secondly, since cosmic evolution is the central scientific theory within contemporary science, if your science fiction is going to be credible, it needs to be consistent with the notion of cosmic evolution. And so our contemporary scientific narrative is cosmic evolution, and so if science fiction is inspired by science, then it needs to be consistent with evolution. Now, we find an evolution of visions of future humanity that are informed by an evolving theory of evolution, because evolution came on the scene 150 years ago, if you use a modern concept of evolution, and over that time it itself has been evolving. So if I take these three classic novels in science fiction, The Time Machine, 1895, Last and First Men, 1930, and Diaspora, 1997, all three have to do with the future evolution of humans, but the theories of evolution that inform each of those three novels have evolved over the last, 100 years. And so by the time we get to Diaspora, we have conscious minds living in robots, virtual minds that ascend up through an infinite series of levels of reality. And Last and First Men, we had genetic engineering going on back in the 1930s. In The Time Machine, we had social stratification and a division of labor that eventually turned into the Eloys and the Morlocks. So science fiction is an evolving expression of holistic future consciousness, and in fact it is guiding human evolution. I put up some other images of some other very famous novels about future humanity, or the evolution of humanity in the future. Child of Zen, which a lot of people may know, and More Than Human, which is about Homo Gestalts, where you have 5 people who had one conscious mind, and Odd John, which was also written by Olaf Stapleton as well. So, given that introduction, let's see how far we get with history. The ancient beginnings of science fiction. And I start with the battle of beings of the moon and the sun. I'm writing about things I have neither seen nor experienced nor heard tell of from anybody else. Things, which is more, that do not in fact exist and could not ever exist at all. So my readers must not believe a word I say. Those lines are written about 150 AD, and they were written by Lucian, who wrote the first science fiction novel, 150 AD, roughly. And true history, even though Lucian says, don't believe anything I say, contained in it all kinds of anticipations of science fiction and the future, which came to pass in the last 2,000 years. It involves a sailing ship that ends up getting pulled up to the moon on a vortex of water, where they meet people who live on the moon, who have strange different kinds of behaviors, and the males give birth and the females don't. And the people on the moon are about ready to get into a war with the people who live on the sun over who's going to colonize the morning star, which is Venus. And creatures from Sirius get into it as well, and it turns into an interstellar spatial battle with spatial technologies, because there's space spiders who make webs across space, and there's a telescope in it, and a variety of other interesting things. And Lucian was letting his mind go sort of imaginatively crazy, but in a lot of ways he anticipated many of the things that would emerge later on in science as well as in science fiction. Now, there's a lot more I could say before the modern times, but I'm not going to talk about it because I don't have enough time. So I'm going to jump right up to the modern origins of science fiction. And the modern origins of science fiction take place with the scientific transformation of our understanding of nature and the heavens, where we developed a new theory of reality, a new theory of knowledge, and a new theory of credibility in the period of 1600, 1500, if you want to go back that far, up to 1700, with people like René Descartes and Copernicus and Giordano Bruno, who got burned at the stake, and Francis Bacon and Isaac Newton and Galileo. Underneath there I have an important line. the expansion of consciousness, imagination, and the universe. Now, since we're listening to diverse points of view, I'm going to throw out a diverse point of view. And my point of view is going to be that the image of the universe that has emerged in modern science vastly, unquestionably surpasses in depth, profundity, and immensity anything that was ever produced by ancient minds, classical myths, and classical religions. That is, our understanding of reality exploded over the last 300 years. Exploded. Our consciousness, our imagination exploded. So in fact, we can tell credible stories within a credible scientific universe that are gigantically more mind-boggling than anything the ancients could have ever imagined. One of the great architects of the scientific revolution was Johannes Kepler. And Johannes Kepler would be a first example I can give you of somebody who was a scientist and definitely had a scientific framework, but he was also a mystic. And he wrote the first modern science fiction novel, which was Somnium, which was published in 1608. And again, we have a story of somebody going to the moon. But what Kepler did in the story was he had a mystical part, which is our character gets to the moon facilitated by a witch who takes him up there. But once he's up on the moon, he gives a scientifically informed description of the surface of the moon and the kind of creatures that would have conceivably lived in that kind of ecology. And in fact, creatures that were living on the side of the moon that was facing the Earth have a different kind of mentality than the creatures who live on the side of the moon that don't face the Earth. And he also believed in space travel. I forgot to mention that on the right-hand side. Also, early on, we started to get our modern utopias. Three very well-known ones are Utopia by Sir Thomas More, Campanello's The City of the Sun, and then Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. Now, these were visions of ideal societies. They also were societies that were discovered on journeys taken to unknown places. They were extraordinary journeys to the ideal. And in all three cases, the writers argued that the type of society they were describing was a model that humanity in general should attempt to follow to try to create a better world for tomorrow. That is, they were futuristic utopias. They were ideal societies that pointed toward a better world in the future. And Francis Bacon in particular included in the New Atlantis like 2 or 3 dozen very interesting technological possibilities that might emerge, like genetic engineering and virtual reality and extension of longevity of human life. So he was anticipating lots of notions we have of technological inventiveness to come. Now, on the heels of the scientific revolution, we get the Age of Enlightenment and the theory of progress. And what the theory of secular progress provided, it provided the idea that if we use science and technology and reason in order to improve reality, the future will be different than the present. So I can imagine a strange future that is credible because, in fact, science and technology and reason will lead to that kind of different reality than the reality we're in. And so, even though we can go all the way back to St. Augustine on the notion of progress and not Zoroaster, in modern times the idea of progress or things getting better in the future starts with the Age of Enlightenment in Europe in the 18th century. Now, one of the great architects of the Age of Enlightenment was Voltaire. And Voltaire actually wrote a science fiction novel. In fact, it was the first alien visitation novel, Micromegas. And in the novel, we have a being, a creature, who comes from the star Sirius, a second one who comes from the planet Saturn, and they come down to the Earth to see if there's any intelligent life down here. But all they see are these tiny little bugs scurrying about on the surface. And who are the tiny little bugs?
Humans.
Humans, of course, because these two characters were gigantic, physically gigantic. And they could not fathom how these tiny little bugs could possibly have any intelligence, and so they developed a technological device to communicate with us, and we told these two giant beings who had powers vastly superior to us that we understood consciousness, we understood the mind, we quoted John Locke and all the other great philosophers, and we told them that we understood everything, and the novel ends on that comical note because the two characters from Cirrus and Saturn leave thinking, you know, what arrogant, foolish jerks we are that we think that we understand the entire universe and these little bugs that float around down here on the Earth. On the heels of the Enlightenment, because not everybody liked the Enlightenment, this other factor played into the development of science fiction, which is romanticism. Maybe technology and industry and progress is not good. Maybe we should go back to nature. Maybe instead of reason, we should emphasize emotion and passion. Maybe instead of objectivity, we should try to emphasize subjectivity. Maybe instead of science, we should revel in art. And romanticism at one level was a reaction against the Enlightenment. It's a reaction that's still with us because we still have lots of romantics around in that sense of people who find technological, industrial, scientific progress somehow dehumanized. But at the same time, during the Romantic era, there were various scientists and poets who saw a way to unite together emotion and reason. And two significant figures of that period were William Herschel, who not only discovered the planet Uranus, he was a classical composer when he was young, but Herschel figured out that the stars actually had lifespans and evolved. And the nebulas were maybe galaxies. And Herschel built the biggest telescopes of his time. But he was also very romantic. He thought science was an art. He thought science involved passion. And there was also David Humphreys, who was a great chemist at the time, who did some early, in fact, he did an awful lot of first-person experiments with various chemicals, and he wrote out his psychological reactions to different hallucinogenic and psychologically effective drugs in poetry. So his science actually was poetic. Well, one of the branches off of Romanticism, an extreme form of Romanticism, was the Gothic. And the Gothic developed just toward the end of the 18th century. And the Gothic emphasized horror, mystery, madness, lots of crazy people in it. Okay, retro, let's go back to the past, and the supernatural. These were all antithetical to science. In spite of that, the Gothic was going to become infused into science fiction because when lots of people think of science fiction, they think of things that are spooky and horrific, etc., etc. They don't necessarily think of ghosts, but they think of things along those lines. One of the earliest and most famous of the Gothic novels was The Vampire, written by John William Polidori, who was an MD, in fact, was a physician for Coleridge the poet, and he wrote The Vampire based on a deer that, in a contest between himself and three other people who spent a summer, was it a summer, I think, in a little villa in Italy or Switzerland. And the three other people were Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley, and Lord Byron. Now, one of those other three people also wrote a story off of this deer. And that was Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Now, some people say that Frankenstein was the first modern science fiction movie. Novel. Except, if you read Frankenstein, as opposed to watch one of the many movies, Frankenstein is 250 pages of an obsessive-compulsive neurotic ruminating on what a terrible person he is for having created this creature, and after he created the creature, he runs away from it, so of course the creature develops an inferiority complex and wreaks havoc on other people around Frankenstein. In fact, even though Mary Shelley called Frankenstein the modern Prometheus, Prometheus was a hero. Prometheus stole the fire from the gods, which gave us the capacity for progress and for moving forward and being equal to the gods. Frankenstein had an immense guilt complex and was an anti-hero. In fact, Shelley wrote this book as something which was supposed to be a horror story, that is, to write about what was most terrible and awful that somebody could do, which was to play God, which was the great blasphemy. Don't mess with Mother Nature, which is exactly what we do with science and technology. So, actually, you could say Frankenstein was an anti-science fiction novel, because it was against everything that science fiction, when it's positive, talking about various developments in science and technology and progress, stands for. But, as J.T. Frazier said, nightmares are dreams whose usefulness is to keep us on our toes. And so Frankenstein is a classical nightmare. And if you look at modern science fiction cinema, Frankenstein, in one form or another, the theme shows up over and over and over again. That is, we keep creating nightmares of how we will take our technology, how we will take our scientific advances, and then they will turn on us, will wreck our lives, will wreck the world, etc., etc. That is, Frankenstein as a nightmare gets used over and over again. In fact, it's archetypal. So, by the time you get up to Frankenstein, and science fiction has begun to form, science fiction has a double-edged sword to it. On one hand, there's hope and wonder. On the other hand, there's fear and terror. Hope and wonder come out of the Enlightenment, out of science, out of the idea of progress. Fear and terror over the future come out of Romanticism and the Gothic. But, as Ortega y Gasset said, since man is above all future-making, he is above all a swarm of hopes and fears. And science fiction contains lots of hopes and contains lots of fears. It's emotional element. Now, I often ask people, who wrote the original Mummy? Well, it was Jane Loudon in 1827. And after she wrote this, she actually wrote a series of books on gardening. And this was the only science fiction novel she wrote. And The Mummy is a horror story. Well, actually, the original Mummy was a science fiction story that took place in the 22nd century. And it's the first modern, relatively thorough vision of the future. And it was inspired in part by Frankenstein, because the mummy is a corpse, a mummified pharaoh, Cheops in fact, who is galvanized back to life through electricity. And the mummy turns out to be the good guy in the story. The humans turn out to be the bunch of imbeciles. But that's an example of the Gothic moving into science fiction. The one in particular that really mixed together horror, Gothic, madness with science fiction was Edgar Allan Poe. We tend to think of Edgar Allan Poe more as horror and Gothic, but Edgar Allan Poe actually wrote about 15 science fiction novels, not novels, stories, and maybe 10 different types of essays about the future of humanity. And I like this quote from Thomas Dish: a starving artist, a devious liar, a drunkard, a sexual reprobate, and an all-around mad genius whom one can easily imagine inhabiting his own sensational fictions. And he was particularly interested in mesmerism and hypnotism and galvanism, where you galvanize people with electricity and maybe get something that's dead come back to life. So Poe was a significant figure in merging together science fiction with horror. Now, there was a Frenchman who really liked Poe and studied him and actually wrote some essays on him. It was very much inspired by him. And that figure was Jules Verne. Now, when we think of Jules Verne, it doesn't seem to be the same kind of character that Poe was, but in fact, Verne got a lot of his inspiration originally from Edgar Allan Poe. Now, Jules Verne wrote a whole series of what were called extraordinary voyages between 1860 and 1905. And these novels, including Journey to the Center of the Earth and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, and Off on a Comet, Mysterious Island, they contained in them more scientific and technological depth than anything anybody had written before in narrative form. That is, Jules Verne brought science and technology into science fiction. Mary Shelley did not. Mary Shelley had almost no science and technology in Frankenstein. And in fact, if you really want to get nauseated over how many different kinds of fish there are under the ocean, read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And if you really want to know more than you ever really want to know about geology, read Journey to the Center of the Earth. But Verne generally did not write about the future. In his second year of starting to publish his extraordinary voyages, he did send in one novel to Pierre Jules Herzl, his editor. And Herzl rejected it because he said it was too depressing. And it never got published. And it was Paris in the 20th century. And that was Verne's most effective futurist novel. But it was depressing, because in the 20th century, as he envisioned it, our central character was a poet who couldn't find a job and couldn't find anybody to have a romantic relationship with, because all the women were career women and didn't have time for romance and love. And in the end of the story, the main character dies frozen in a cemetery someplace. But Jules Verne, as Herzl says, his aim was to outline all the geographical, geological, physical, and astronomical knowledge amassed by modern science, and to recount in an entertaining and picturesque format that is his own, the history of the universe. And Verne was, of course, one of the most influential early people in science fiction. And most people have heard of him. Now, here's a person, though, on the other hand, that you may not have heard of. In fact, what is the date, May 1st, 1871, the day science fiction was invented? There's a gentleman on the web who actually has that up as an article. And he has it up because on that day, 3 highly significant science fiction novels were either published or submitted to for publication. And the first one was Vril, The Power of the Coming Race, by Edward Bulwer Lytton. And in this novel, we have a character who goes down below the surface of the earth, meets advanced humans who are much bigger and smarter than us, much more technically advanced than we are, and in fact are cyborgs who from birth have this educational relationship and symbiosis with magical technological wands through which they can wield great power. And they're getting overpopulated in the caves. And they're thinking maybe they want to come up and take over the top surface of the earth, which is where we are. And so here's a real nightmare on one hand, but it's also utopia on the other hand, because the Vrilya who live down below are vastly superior to us. Now, even if you've never heard of this novel in its day was immensely popular. And all kinds of clubs sprouted up all over Europe connected with this in anticipation of people, advanced people from below the surface of the earth coming up. Now, 1871 is when Darwin published The Descent of Man. And in 1871, Erewhon, which is sort of nowhere spelled backwards or over the range, was published by Samuel Butler. Now, William Morris was a writer of the time who was anti-progress, anti-industry, anti-technology. The transcendentalists in the United States were also romanticists, Thoreau and Emerson, who were definitely anti-technology in lots of ways and wanted to go out into nature and immerse oneself in nature and get back to that more pure reality. But Butler in Erewhon really hit the nail on the head. because what he suggested, and if you read the 3 chapters called Darwin Among the Machines, which are in that novel, what he suggested is that the principles of evolution apply to machines as well as biological life. And the machines are evolving faster than humans are. And that we are becoming increasingly servants of machines, caretakers of machines. And that in the relatively near future, they are going to surpass us, and we in fact will be outnumbered inferior slaves to them. And so we better get rid of machines, because they're going to be that form of being which surpasses and transcends us. And it's a very entertaining novel, too. Now I come up to, I mentioned it before, Albert Rabida. And Rabida, in the 20th century, wrote an ambiguous utopia. This is a very funny book to read. And it's so funny in part because Rabida hit the nail on the head in so many different ways regarding what was coming in the next 100 years. As he states, overwrought, wired up, frightfully busy and nervous, life in the electrical age, we must admit, has overtaxed the human race and brought about a kind of universal degeneration. And here's a bunch of pictures from the 20th century and some of his other novels. Okay? Rabida envisioned news becoming entertainment. He envisioned big media screens all over the place in which reality was being orchestrated and plotted out and constructed and then sold to the population. He envisioned things like big corporations taking control of the world to the point where a corporate conglomerate bought the country of Italy to turn it into an amusement park. And another corporation went out and pulled the moon in closer so the image of the moon in the sky would be bigger for lovers. And in the end, they build an 8th continent because they're running out of room, and they name it after the heroine of the novel, who is Helena. And Helena doesn't want to have anything to do with women emancipation and women power, and she just wants to be taken care of by her husband and have lots of kids. And so it's a hilarious book to read, but it's very on target in so many different respects. Now, if Rabida hits upon our contemporary pessimism and how the world may be going down the tubes, a real shocker to sit and read, Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy, which was written in 1887, and I won't tell you why it's called Looking Backward, you have to read it, is a shocker because Bellamy is incredibly optimistic about the future. He believes that we are right on the edge of this great transcendence to a higher level of happiness and well-being. And he was a total socialist. He believed that society should be run like an army and that we would end up without having any kind of poor people, crazy people. Everybody would have to participate in the caretaking of that society. And this book, when it was out, sold more copies than any other book of its time except for the Bible. Robots. Now, I haven't gone into the history of robots, but I'll come right now with a robot because it's an interesting robot. Created by Thomas Edison. And Thomas Edison is the great scientific wizard of the late 19th century. And Thomas Edison appears in science fiction novels, including The Future Eve. And in The Future Eve, Thomas Edison creates a robot for his friend who has fallen in love with this woman who his friend believes is totally shallow, and he's so infatuated with her and he can't break free of her. And so Thomas Edison creates a better version of that woman as a robot, better than the original. And it's the first time the word android gets used. It's a female robot, and it's the first instance in literature of the Turing test. And the Turing test is, can you tell the difference between a human and a robot? Can a robot or a computer fool you? And in this novel, the robot fools the human character. It's a really good description scientifically of how you would construct a robot, and it's also philosophically a very interesting novel regarding what the relationship is between consciousness in the mind and a physical body. How much time do I have?
5 minutes.
Good, fine.
That's correct.
Yes. A few more slides. You got to mention Camille Flammarion. And Camille Flammarion is a French astronomer toward the end of the 19th century who, on one hand, really knew his science, wrote lots of books on astronomy, but he also believed in reincarnation, and besides having a telescope in his house, he also had a room for doing seances. And Flammarion laid out all the different possible theories of the way the world would end, and then wrote a novel about it called Omega. In Lumen, he travels through the universe guided by a ghost. And Flammarion was the first person who applied evolution as a scientific theory to understanding alien life on other planets. And in Lumen, you see how Flammarion applies evolution to life on Mars, etc., etc. But he believed that when you die, your soul goes up to the next planet at a higher level, and from there goes up to another planet. And so he thought we keep getting reincarnated through higher and higher levels of planetary spheres. And that was the Flammarion engraving on the back there. And now, that brings me up to just H.G. Wells, and I'm going to stop at H.G. Wells. And most people would say, well, that's where science fiction begins, but obviously not. H.G. Wells was the father of modern science fiction and also the father of modern future studies. And as he said, he was extravagantly obsessed with the thing that might be and impatient with the present. And his great teacher was Thomas Huxley, who was an evolutionary scientist who taught Wells evolution, and Wells was a thoroughgoing evolutionist. Now, most people may not know this, but somebody in here may, that even though Wells wrote at least a dozen really good science fiction novels, from War of the Worlds to The Island of Dr. Moreau, his biggest selling book was The Outline of History. And Wells really knew history. And Wells was an intellect of a significant level. And Wells was hoping that humanity would be able to achieve a better world in the future, achieve a utopia. And he wrote several books, A Modern Utopia and Men Like Gods and The Shape of Things to Come, where he envisioned utopias. But at the same time, Wells was really great at writing war stories and mayhem and disaster. Now, of course, we know the War of the Worlds, but you may not be familiar with the War in the Air, which is a hilarious book about humanity almost entirely wiping itself out with aerial machines. And the world set free, humanity almost entirely wipes itself out. And in that book is where Wells anticipates the atomic bomb. And Wells as his thinking matured, ended up believing that, yes, we can get to a better world in the future, a utopia, but the only way we're going to get there is through some kind of worldwide disaster and collapse of civilization. So, that's probably a good place to stop, although I just wanted to point out just one more slide. After Wells, Méliès and the beginning of science fiction movies and cinema. Méliès was the creator of and father of special effects, and was often the actor in his own movies, and his wife was in the movies as well too. And he started science fiction cinema back in about 1905 when Wells was writing his science fiction novels. So that's as far as I can get. So anyway, we will just stop there, and we have a minute or two for any comments or questions if you want to. Yeah. Yes, in the corner.
I have two questions.
Flip the light on if you want.
The Star Maker, do you think that the Star Maker inspired the writers of The Matrix? You know how there's a Star Maker in it, and you know how in The Matrix there's that character that, obviously the guy who makes the world.
Yes, I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and rewatch The Matrix again.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
The other question is, Marvel comics and
Yes.
superhero comics, where
Right.
does that fit into this type of?
Oh, yes, of course. In fact, comics was one wave in the evolution, one tributary in the evolution of science fiction, starting with Buck Rogers, Superman, Flash Gordon. That stream runs up to the present too. And comic books, all of those superheroes are science fiction characters. By the way, The Matrix was really inspired by Rene Descartes' malevolent demon in one of his philosophical books, where Descartes asked the question, how do I know if I'm not lying on a table in a laboratory with wires hooked up to my brain and some malevolent, all-powerful, or very powerful demon is stimulating my brain to think I'm having all of these experiences when really I'm not? And that's the Matrix, and Descartes had that idea in 1630. Other comments, questions? No? No? Okay, I guess it's time for food. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you. Yeah.